Hello, hello. For this one, let's work on error handling and the submit button. By error handling, I mean if we aren't meeting, for example, our minimum letter threshold, which the spelling bee, New York Times spelling bee game has a minimum of 4 letters. So let's say man. Too short, right? Or if we don't use the center letter, we get that error. So let's add that first. So what I want to do is in my configuration, we will have, I just thought of something too. We want to have some variable to specify what the minimum letter count is, right? But what if we have game modes where that changes? Should that be something that's driven by the current game mode we're on? And if that's the case, should that be, should the bubble count also be driven by that game mode, right? So let's do that. I think everything should actually be driven by the game mode that we're on, right? So like, what if we have a game mode where the letters are different? Like, are we going to have any sort of configuration that doesn't change at all between all the game modes? I'm not sure that we would, or that we'd want to build it that way. So what we should really do is, should we have a configuration file like this for each game mode? We probably should. So here's what I want to do. Here's what I want to do. Const startup. What I want to do is simulate what we would have if we had, some sort of startup method that fires, that grabs the correct configuration, the correct game mode configuration, right? So let's actually do that. I'm not going to save this yet. Let's go back to the bubble trouble. And here in our document.ready method, and remember, this is the same as document.ready. Okay. So first thing we should do is call a startup function. And let's add that to the very beginning. Startup. Okay. Poker. I won't do that again, I promise. Maybe. So let's say that here in our startup we have, this is where we'll define what game mode we want to play with. So I'll also have a const config variable. I'll just make it an empty array or an empty object for now, right? And hopefully it'll make sense why I'm doing this. Specify game mode. And part of why I'm doing this is future proofing. So if in the future, this were to become let's say like an iOS app, right? When we first launch the game, we might want to give the players an option to choose the game mode, right? So if all of these methods in the core game script are very married to a certain game mode, it's going to be difficult to actually go in and change all of those values, right? Whereas if everything is driven in one place, or if the game mode that we're playing with is driven in one place, then it'll be easier to modify this or convert it or stretch it so that we can actually turn it into like a full-fledged, iOS game, for example. So if in the startup method we are defining the config or the game mode, then it's going to be easier down the line, I think. So let's say config equals, actually before I do that, I'll show you what I was trying to do here. So let's ditch this startup. Let's do, so what are our variants? What are our variants? We've got standard and easy so far. So let's do standard config, and then easy config, right? And then now here I can say the config that we care about is standard config, okay? And remember, right now I can access these objects because on my actual page I've imported the variants and the config script first, right? The only reason I'm doing it this way is because we don't have this. This isn't actually running on a web server right now. Right now it's just, for the most part, just a static HTML page that I'm just running locally, right? So this is just a quicker way of breaking everything up into multiple scripts without relying on running a node application and importing these scripts. So hopefully that made some sense. So you'll see all of these places are referencing config, and originally, let me undo this. Originally they were referencing this object, but I changed everything. So now this config variable lives here, and we're just saying that, hey, this config for now is the standard config object. And we can test that. So let's change this bubble count here to like 10 and preview this game, right? What's broken? Something's broken. We're not calling startup, I'm guessing. Or are we? We are calling startup. Invalid assignment. Oh, well, we're making it constant. So you'll notice here, can I do this actually? Let's see if I can do this. Nope, it doesn't let me do that. So originally what I'm doing is I'm saying the variable config is this empty object, and then later in this method I'm saying, hey, now config is this object, which you can't do with constants, right? So that worked. Everything is business as usual, right? But now let's say, hey, instead of playing the standard game mode, let's play the easy game mode. And now you'll see we have more bubbles because in the easy configuration, I said that our bubble count is 10. So that's easy. Cool. So we fixed the game mode configuration a little bit. What we were trying to do is actually add the error handling, right? So in the standard game mode, the min word length is 4, right? So let's work on that first. So what we want to happen is when the user clicks submit, which we have to add a method for submit, right? And make sure that that is in fact the ID of that submit button, which it is. That's fine actually. Yep. So let's test that out first. And do alert, submit, clicked, right? And now if I hit submit, submit clicked, great. So we probably want another method. So what do we want to happen when we hit submit? First, before we call any sort of API, we want to validate our letter assembly line. Make sure that this is a valid word. Not ensure that it's actually a word, because remember that's what the API is doing, but make sure that it meets all of our criteria before even doing the check to see if it's a word. So in this case, this wouldn't be a valid word because it's only 3 letters. So when we hit submit, we want to validate this, and if it passes, then we submit it to the API. So let's do handle, let's make a method handle validation. And this gives us an opportunity to do some clever configuration too. So in the configuration here, we can probably specify, depending on our game mode, our validation method might look different, right? So I think in this config, class, not really a class, this config file, we could have a function standard validation. Which really, we'd probably want to break this up into a different file and have it in like a services folder. So we have services that handle this validation for us, but I think for now this is probably fine. So standard validation, and we'll have that taken a word, okay? And let's do if word.length is less than our min word length, return false. Otherwise return true. And we don't have to, I don't have to put this in an if or an else block, because if this is true, then we'll just hit this line and there's no chance of hitting this line, okay? So now let's say validation method is standard validation. And I don't want to call it, I just want to say, hey, why is that blue? Maybe it's because, okay, it makes our function properties blue, which in JavaScript functions are really objects, but let's not get into that. So here in this submit function, we're calling handle validation, and I want to keep the camel case syntax going, so lowercase h, handle validation. Let's create that function, handle validation, and for now, all handle validation is doing is calling our config.validation method. And it's actually calling it, right? Before I test this, I want to give our easy config object that property and make a copy of this. Let's say easy validation. And let's say the minimum word length is 3 for this, right? You'll notice these two functions right now are identical, and I'm okay with that for now. If we end up having like 4 or 5 different game modes and all of those game modes have this same logic, the same logic being there's a notion of a minimum word length, then we might have that's where the notion of like inheritance would come in, where these different validation modes all share that universal validation logic, which is making sure that the word length or doing this minimum word length check. If they all have it, then we could break this out and maybe it would be worth demonstrating what that looks like. I'm thinking if it's worth even doing that now. Hopefully what I'm explaining makes some sense. Where like each of these different validation modes would call, test validation, word, and it would call like a global validation. And this, global validation would do the validation logic that's shared by all of these validation methods. And then after that is when we would, let's say like var is valid equals. And if the global validation passed, or I guess what would make more sense is like shared validation, that all of these different validation methods share. So validation for all of these different game modes share, rather. And then if is valid, then we would do the validation that's custom to this validation mode. Or to this specific game mode. But I'm not going to worry about that now. So let's go ahead and test and make sure that these validation methods have passed. So on submit, call handle validation. And let's do return config.validation. I'm having a hard time here. Return config validation method. So let's do, let's actually call this, let's actually call this function is valid. And then do if not is valid, then we'll show an alert. Actually, sorry. If not is valid, alert. Invalid for now, okay? So, since we are on the standard game mode, our minimum word length is 4, so if we just enter RTS, oh, I'm not passing in that word is our problem. So remember, we're saving that in the LAL word variable. Every time we click on a bubble, we save it in LAL word. But we're not passing that word into is valid. And then is valid isn't passing that word into the validation method, because the validation method takes in a word as a parameter. So AXJ, submit. Min word length is not defined, which makes sense because it should be standard config.min word length. And this should be easy config.min word length. So NAT, it's invalid. NATG, Nothing, no error. So that works. Let's try now changing the game mode to easy. And now the minimum word length, so we're seeing 10 bubbles now, but the minimum word length is also 3. So now I shouldn't get an error. I shouldn't see anything, and I'm not. If it's just 2, now I do. So we've added some simple error handling, as well as, I think, fixing our game mode configuration. So in the next one, I think we're probably ready to actually test and see if it's a valid word. So let's see that in the next one. Okay, I think the easiest way to validate whether or not our word is actually a word is to call this Merriam Webster API that we talked about at the beginning of this series. And we know that if we get this sort of JSON response back, we can conclude that it is actually a word, right? So what I had to do is I had to create a profile here on Merriam Webster, which, let me just sign out real quick. So if I sign out, this shows you how to get started with their API. So you can register an account, get a verification email, sign in, and then you'll have access to your keys in the API retrieval page. So let me pause this real quick and just sign back in. So if you click on your keys, you can view the keys, and you can use up to 2 different APIs, 2 different kinds of APIs, and really their different APIs are just pointing to different databases. I believe they've got different dictionary types depending on, well, they have different databases for the different dictionary types and different APIs pointing to those different databases. So, free as long as it's for non-commercial use, and we're not exceeding 1,000 queries per day. So, we just have to be careful when we're testing this and make sure we're not, I'm hoping that I don't get anywhere close to that 1,000, but we'll see. We'll see. Depends on how much I mess up these API calls. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to make a new script and just call this api.js. And I'm just going to have like my const, let's say const API equals, and this will be the actual URL. And then const API key equals my key. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's look at their APIs. Let's look at the, I'll use the collegiate dictionary. I think that this is the most comprehensive one. It has 225,000 definitions, whereas the Learner's Dictionary has 100,000. So the collegiate should work. And I'm going to grab this URL, and I'll end here, because this is the actual URL for the API. And then I'm going to pause it and grab my API key and plug it into this script. And then I can just reference the script and shouldn't have to show it again. If my API key is revealed, I'm not super worried about it. Where there might be some concern is, if I've linked some payment method to my account and my API key leaks, someone can rack up some serious bill on my account by triggering this API thousands of times, right? For this simple dummy app, I'm not worried about it, but it's just something to keep in mind in your projects when you're using APIs. You do not want to reveal your API key, and you definitely don't want to have an API key saved in some file that's added to, a version control, and then, or added to a Git repo and then posted to GitHub, where people can see it. GitHub is smart enough where it'll scan your files and see if it detects some sensitive data like that. But I wouldn't rely on them catching it. I would, better yet, just don't post it, right? So really what we should have is those API keys will be saved in some sort of key vault or environment variable. That value will actually get either parsed by the server that's running it, or it's not revealed. It's every time that's called, we're grabbing that value from the key vault. But we're not going to worry about that here. So I'm going to pause it and grab my key and save it. Okay, grabbed it, saved it into api.js, and I'm calling api.js here as well. So I should be able to access that value from my other scripts. So let's say that the user clicks submit, and it passes validation. So we're actually ready now to call our API and check if it's a valid word, right? So I just added a return statement here, so anything I add after this has no chance of being hit if it's invalid. So let's call get, let's do var def, var definition equals get definition from API. And here's where we'll actually be responsible for calling the API. And we'll do a jQuery dot Ajax call. And if we look at the documentation for jQuery.ajax, here are some examples. Let's see. So I think by default, it's going to make a GET request. Let's just see. I think by default, it's making a GET request. I can also just call jQuery.get directly, which under the hood is calling Ajax, which is part of why I'd rather just call Ajax. So let me just copy this code here from the example. And our URL is going to be our API, which I think I'm just calling it API. Let's make it a function first. Function. And then lowercase g, get definition from API. And what we want to do is I think this is what I want to do. Make this an async function because this is an async. We're making an asynchronous Ajax request. So, for example, if this is a synchronous function, and I have code here, var test equals blah, 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 this code will execute before we necessarily get a response. So if I do await, let's do var def equals await. And then I want to console.log def. Just see what that gives me. And I'm going to call, no, not the context. I don't think I care about the context. I want to, let's see. Does this have any other simple examples? So I can specify the URL. This is closer to what I want. So let's do this. Let's grab that. Equals await. The method is get. The URL is just the API. And then our data is actually passed into the URL as a query string parameter. So the API is reading it from the URL. It's not reading it from the body. So what we want to do is say the URL is API / whatever our word is, which is LEL word. And then if we look at an example, okay. So unfortunately, I just revealed my API keys when I was trying to show you this page. So hopefully I remember to go in and blur that out. If I don't, it's not the end of the world. Worst case, someone's going to get lots of definitions using my API, which will be short-lived anyways. So this is the actual route. So you can see the last portion of this route is the actual word, and then we've got the query string value and my API key. All right, so like this, and my API key should straight up be API key. So let's try that. And let's do .fail. Oops. And then just do try that. See what that gives me. It gives me an error, is what it gives me. We need to make this an async function if we're going to use await. And it shouldn't yell at me now. However, we turn this into a lowercase g. So now let's try. I think I'll have to finagle that function, but let's see first. Did I change the game mode to easy? I must have, huh? I must have. Yes, because I'm seeing 10 words and I'm not seeing our keyword, our center word. So let's change it to standard configuration. And now let's try, I don't think I can even make a word. Do I have any vowels? No. Yes, there are words without vowels, but they're few and far between. K, I, P, P, P. It's not a word, but we'll hit submit and see what I get. So what are we getting? What are we getting? First, we're logging definition, and that is returning this promise. So give me 1 second to make sure I can actually explain this clearly. Okay, so I changed this up. Now what I'm doing is get definition from API is just returning this. Let's pull up the actual documentation. So it's returning this AJAX call, and then here in submit, I've changed this method in submit to be an asynchronous function, and I'm saying wait for that asynchronous HTTP request that's being called in here. Wait for that to actually return, and then I'm doing something with it, right? So what I wanted to see is, am I actually waiting until I get a response back? So I'm logging this blah, because if I see that blah as soon as I click submit, it tells me that I'm not actually waiting until I get a response back from the API, so the Merriam Webster server. Oops. So FRBC, submit, and you see there was a slight delay. So for example, let's do blah, or let's do foo and bar, right? Because that's foo bar is standard for stuff like this among programmers, and I'm not creative. Mass, that's a word. So I would expect to see, if you look at this console, once I hit submit, I would expect to see foo right away, and then a slight delay before bar. So you see that? So I'm waiting until we get a response back, and this is the response that I'm getting. I'm getting an array of objects with all the different definitions of mass, right? So it's good. So now we're getting a definition. So what do we want to do with that? First of all, let's see what we get if let's see what we get if we don't submit a valid word. We still get an array, but we're now just getting an array of strings with possible words, like did you mean this, right? If it can't find the actual word. So we know if, for example, object dot what's this HOM? And do I always have HOM? I don't always have HOM, but I always have short def. So let's do if definition 0 dot short def. If that exists, then we want to do something. If it has a definition, then we want to do something. Oops. Otherwise, alert, invalid word, right? And what do we want to do? We want to save the word. Save the word to our our secondary window here that we're not currently using, right? So let's do save word. Oops. Save word. And create a function for that. And all we have to do is we've already got the word in that letter assembly line variable. So let me go over to our HTML page and see how we want to actually display this, right? Let me get rid of this test because this is something else. I was messing around with something else that's not important. So let me try this. We've got our secondary window. Let's do .deflex, .flex, wrap, and then add a .badge. And you see an example of this. Let me pull up jQuery badges to show you what I'm actually trying to make. Pill badges, okay. Let's save it as, so there's badge secondary. What other kind of badges do we have? Let's do light. Let's do badge light. Oops. Let's try that and see. Okay. So I added padding around here. Maybe this should actually be here. I think I had one too many classes. Yeah, I didn't need that extra class. Okay. So what happens if I have lots of badges? How does that look? Let's add some padding or a margin between the badge. Like MR or, yeah, MR-2. Let's try that and see. Or MR-1. And now see what the copies look like. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Yeah, I like that. So we'll do something very similar to what we did with the bubbles, where we have a template. We have a template badge that we're copying. Let me see. Yeah, that's fine. We have a template badge that we're copying, and then we're saving the actual word there. So let's do this. Let's do word badge. Make a new class, and we're only using that class right now for the purpose of quickly finding it with jQuery. So let's do word badge.first .clone .append to .append to, we want to append it to this, which will give it an ID of what? And how am I declaring our other IDs? What is the syntax that I'm using? I just want to keep it consistent for the IDs at least. ID equals, I'm using Pascal case. So there's some inconsistencies with my variable names, or at least my naming conventions I'm using throughout this app, but it's not a huge deal. I'm not terribly concerned about it. Let's do saved word container. Append that to saved word container. And then we want to set the actual HTML of that badge. The HTML of the badge. And notice how what's nice about using jQuery is I can chain commands like this together because each one of these functions returns the object that I was calling the function on. And the HTML should be LEL word. And let's see if we can't test this with a valid word. Let me try new list. D-I-N-E. Boom. So that's big. Think about what we're doing. We're making a call to the Merriam Webster API, and if it's giving us a valid word back, we're saving it here. For example, if I were to try dine and submit it, not a valid word. So that's awesome. We have a working game now. So in the next video, let's talk about some potential problems with this and ways of extending this, right?